Hey guys, this is Jeff, and today I want to look at what it means to be a lukewarm Christian. Before we dive into that, would you hit the subscribe button so you can stay up to date on what's happening on this channel? This term lukewarm Christian gets thrown around a lot, and often you kind of pick up the vibe that it's not a good thing, but rarely have I heard it explained. So I want to dive a little bit deeper and figure out where we got this term from and what it actually means. This term comes from Revelation 3:16, which says, "So because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth." Right off the bat, we can tell that's not a very positive verse. But before we can draw conclusions, we need to look at the context in which it's said. When we approach a passage that we want to understand the meaning of, what we need to understand is the original audience it was written to. In other words, we need to understand the who before you can apply it to you. You see, the context in which a verse is said is very, very important, and there's been much harm done by people that just rip a verse out of context and start saying it and quoting it and build their faith upon it. When we ignore the context of a verse, we will often end up with a wrong and sometimes harmful interpretation of what the Bible is saying. So, before we look at what it means to be a lukewarm Christian, let's dive into the context of Revelation 3:16. In the first few chapters of Revelation, John is recording a message from God written to 7 churches. This message is written to real churches in John's day. However, the message isn't exclusive to them. It also applies to us today. Where we find this verse, Revelation 3:16, is actually in the middle of a section where the church of Laodicea is being addressed. In other words, this verse that we're reading is addressed to a real church full of real people that lived at a certain point in history. And so while there's a message in this passage for us, we need to first understand who it was originally written to. We need to understand the original audience before we can apply it to us. In Revelation 3, verses 14 through 22, the church in Laodicea is receiving a warning from God. That's important because often when we read this verse about what it means to be lukewarm, we think it applies to the unbeliever, but really this verse applies to the believer. It applies to the people that are actually going to church. This isn't a warning for those that aren't following God. This is a warning for those within the church, those that are following God. Within this passage is another famous image that you've probably heard, and it's Jesus knocking at the door that comes in Revelation 3:20. And again, we know from the context that it's written that this verse is actually written to the believer, not the unbeliever. That's why context is so important, because if we don't look at the verses surrounding it, we'll often end up with the wrong or sometimes harmful interpretation of the Bible. So, now that we've looked a little bit at the context, what we know is that this verse is written as a warning to the church in Laodicea. This passage is about how believers, how Christians can sometimes become lukewarm in their faith, and the picture that we're given is that God spits them out of their mouth. So now that we've looked a little bit into the context in which this verse is written, we know that this is being addressed to the church. It's being addressed to Christians. So if you consider yourself a follower of Jesus, this verse is addressed to you. Now, before we can dive into what this verse means, we need to look a little bit deeper into the church of Laodicea and look at a little bit of the history, because the image that God is using in this passage draws from things that were happening in their area. They lived comfortable lives and they were prideful in their ability to provide for themselves. So much so that when an earthquake came in and nearly destroyed their city, they refused financial resources from the Roman Empire and insisted on paying for the rebuild themselves. This attitude of self-sufficiency spilled over into the church. So you had this church that met together regularly and they thought they had enough. They thought they had it all together. In a blunt but spurred from love warning, God says to them, you don't. You don't have it all together. You're not self-sufficient. You need me. That's where that whole lukewarm comment came from. See, cold water is refreshing, hot water soothes, but lukewarm water is good for nothing. You just spit it out because it's not good for anything. And that's a picture of what the church in Laodicea had become. They had become good for nothing because they were self-sufficient. This image of lukewarm water would have struck a chord with the church of Laodicea. It's no mistake that this is the image God chooses to describe this church. You see, this city, this church, all they had access to was warm water. All they had access to was lukewarm water. They knew what it was like to drink lukewarm water. One of the neighboring cities was known for their famous hot springs, where this water would come out hot and it would soothe and it was good and it was useful. But by the time it got to Laodicea, it was lukewarm and good for nothing. They were so close, but yet so far from it. Another city nearby had cool, refreshing springs of water that would just quench your thirst on a hot day. But again, by the time it got to Laodicea, it was lukewarm and it was no longer refreshing. You see, hot water is useful. Cold water is refreshing, but Laodicea had access to neither. All they had was lukewarm water. And what God is telling them is that you are no longer useful to me. You see, hot water is soothing. Cold water is refreshing. And when God says this church has become lukewarm, what he's saying is that they're no longer good for anything. They become stagnant. They become useless, which is why he spits them out of his mouth, because they're no longer useful to him. And this image that God gives them is one that they would have been so familiar with, because their whole existence, all they had was lukewarm water. Now, I think it's important to note that this image of God spitting the church out isn't necessarily a salvation issue, it's a usefulness issue. God is saying that he would prefer his people to be soothing like hot water or refreshing like cold water. Instead, they have become lukewarm. They're not useful. But this isn't a salvation issue, this is a usefulness issue. All right, now that we understand a little bit more of the context in which this verse is written, we can dive into the implications and what this verse means for us today. This passage is full of images and pictures that would have struck a chord with the church in Laodicea. And so I want to kind of continue with that and give you some images, give you some pictures of what a Christian should look like, what a follower of Jesus should look like. The first image of what a Christian should be like is like a cold drink on a hot day. Christians should be refreshing. Is there anything better than after you've been working in the yard on a hot summer day that you come inside and you get that cold beverage, whatever it is for you, water or lemonade or beer, and you drink that cold beverage and it just quenches your thirst and it tastes so good. And as you're drinking it, you can feel your life come back in you. You feel refreshed and revitalized. Is there anything more refreshing than a cold drink on a hot day? And this is a picture of what followers of Jesus should be like a cold drink on a hot day. We should be refreshing, restoring, life-giving. The world is looking for that refreshment, but often all they can find is lukewarm water, but we have access to the most refreshing, coolest drink possible. We should be like a cold drink on a hot day. The second image of what Christians should be like is like hot tea on a sore throat. You see, Christians should bring comfort, like when you're sick and your throat is just throbbing and you make that tea and you drink it and it goes down your throat and it coats it and it just brings refreshment and healing. There's just something about that hot liquid as it makes its way down your throat that it brings healing and comfort in the midst of your pain. You see, not only should Christians be refreshing, but they should also be soothing. We don't have to look very far to see the pain and the suffering that's all around us. And the world is desperately looking for that comforting cup of hot tea for their sore throat. And listen, as followers of Jesus, that's what we have. We can provide comfort and healing in the midst of the world's pain. So we should be like a hot cup of tea to a sore throat. The third image of what Christians should be like is beggars. Remember, the original warning of this passage was that this church had become self-sufficient. They had lost their dependency on God. They thought they could do it all themselves. There's great danger when we think we have what we need. There's great danger when we think we got it all together. We need God. You see, it's only through Christ that we can be refreshing. It's only through Christ that we can be comforting. As Martin Luther said, we are all mere beggars, showing other beggars where we found bread. Have you ever seen a full moon? It can be incredibly breathtaking, the beauty and the detail. But the reality of that moon is that it's nothing special. It's simply reflecting the sun. You see, as Christians, we're just beggars pointing towards something greater than ourselves. We can't be refreshing on our own. We can't bring healing on our own. We can only reflect what God has done for us. We're like the moon. We just reflect the sun. We don't have the source for life. We're just pointing towards the source for life. I think the church in Laodicea has a lot of similarities to the Western church today. The Laodiceans enjoyed material prosperity that led them to this attitude of self-sufficiency that they could do it all themselves. And we too, we've bought into this idea of self-sufficiency. We think we're good enough, we have what we need, we can get by on our own. But when we live like that, we run the risk of becoming a lukewarm Christian. And I want to reiterate, this isn't a salvation issue, this is a usefulness issue. Being lukewarm in the context of this verse means that we've lost our purpose. We stop being useful. And this is a constant danger when Christians live lives of prosperity and of constant ease. So we have to fight against this. We have to fight against this lie of self-sufficiency and recognize that we are dependent on God. And the second that we give up that dependence, we can no longer be refreshing. We no longer can be healing. We can no longer point those to the life that God has for them. But all hope is not lost. This address to the church in Laodicea ends a few verses later with this famous picture of Jesus standing at the door and knocking and asking to come in. And again, we know this isn't addressed to the non-believer. This isn't addressed as Jesus asking to come into somebody's heart. This is addressed to the church. And what Jesus is doing is he's offering a second chance. He's saying, listen, if you want to be useful again, if you want to be refreshing again, if you want to bring healing and comfort again, I'm here. All you have to do is let me in. I don't know where you are, but if you've become lukewarm, this is the picture of Jesus standing on the outside of your heart, asking if he can come in. He's not going to force his way, but he's offering a better way. He's offering to restore you, to refresh you, to bring healing to you. And he's saying, listen, I will not only do this in you, I'll do this through you to those around you. The question you need to wrestle with is, will you let me in? Thanks for watching this video. I hope you learned something. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. I'd love to hear from you.